Hi guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. I hope you like this one. Why is reading fiction important for knowledge? A lot of people these days seem to be of the opinion, or under the impression rather, that fiction is predominantly for entertainment, that is recreational reading, while non-fiction is somehow the more serious type of reading that you do for knowledge. This is not necessarily true, and I would argue that it would be quite disastrous for a society or even an individual to come to that conclusion. I have three reasons why. Number one, fiction gives us a gateway, a portal, a window into historical periods and geographic eras in a way that non-fiction cannot. Because non-fiction, by its very definition, has to focus on the peaks. It has to focus on the monumental moments that happen in any given period of time, right? So you could read a dozen books about the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, and these books would give you all kinds of statistical and numerical knowledge about the invasion. But if you wanted to understand what it was like for ordinary day-to-day Russians just trying to live their lives, experiencing the upheaval of the Napoleonic invasion, you would have to read Tolstoy's War and Peace. And that will give you a perspective that all these works of non-fiction cannot. Another example I often quote is there's a book called Freedom at Midnight, written about the India-Pakistan partition, which I always recommend to people because, once again, there are hundreds of books out there, non-fiction books, about the India-Pakistan partition, but none of them will give you the sense of what it was like for day-to-day Indians, and the tension in the air, and the political sort of web unraveling to where they find out where it becomes increasingly inevitable that India is going to be partitioned, and the horror that follows. All of those things through a kind of fiction prose narrative style that the authors use in Freedom of Midnight gives us a much better sense of what happened rather than a work of non-fiction, traditional non-fiction. The Kite Runner, which was a bestseller, I guess maybe a decade and a half, 2 decades almost ago, right, is a memorable book that I remember reading, which really gave me a very empathetic grassroots snapshot of what it was like for regular Afghans when the Soviets invaded. How normal life was completely turned upside down when the communists invaded. You could read a work of non-fiction and it would tell you about Babri Kamal and the communist takeover and the Soviets announcing on Afghan national radio that they had now taken control. You could get all of those details of names and places and ages and all that from works of non-fiction. But fiction, books like The Kite Runner, is what will give you that proper, tangible sense of living there, of being transported there. So that's the first reason. The second is that fiction also allows us to conduct or explore metaphorical analyses of reality, of the truth. George Orwell's Animal Farm is the best example that I can think of, where even though we know that all these fictional characters stand for historical figures, and that the story unraveling is a giant metaphor for totalitarianism and things like that, we wouldn't have gotten the same sense if that was replicated in a work of non-fiction, or even if it was a work of fiction and the characters were named Stalin and Trotsky and blah blah blah. No, it had to be a work of fiction, and all of them, the themes that all of these real life figures stand for, had to be extrapolated and inserted into animals, and the world that the story was taking place in had to be an animal farm for it to work. And that book, it's such a tiny book, right? And yet it teaches us so much more. Orwell's work in general teaches us so much more about fascism and communism and empire and totalitarianism in general than the work of any other writer, in my opinion. But just a tiny book like Animal Farm that you can read in an hour, that is so much more sort of important in shaping someone's understanding of totalitarianism than 100 books that you can read on totalitarianism. And my final point is that fiction is the basis for human civilization and thought. If you dig through the roots of all cultures, what is the basis that those roots were grown on? It would be mythology, literature, the great epics, poetry, folk tales, indigenous legends, right? These myths are what have shaped the most powerful empires and the smallest, least powerful tribes. There is just something about human nature that makes us fall in love with stories, and the way we think and the stories we tell often have a very heavy, almost prophetic influence on where the human race goes. Look at science fiction as an example. We cannot argue that when we look at technological advancements today and when we look at the current generation of scientists and innovators, they were all very, very heavily influenced by science fiction writers. We cannot deny that Isaac Asimov had a huge impact on the way that technology has developed today. We cannot deny that Arthur C. Clarke had a huge impact, because many of the people who eventually get into these fields, who eventually become the brains behind how these technological fields advance, they would have probably grown up reading the works of these authors, right? And the final point I'd like to make on this last example is satire. Look at the power of satire in revolutions all over the world, and the way in which humor and comedy can often be used to mobilize people and can often be used as the basis of dissent. Because once again, I'm not talking about just general non-fictiony humor, I'm talking about proper satire, right? Throughout the ages, whether this was satirical plays, satirical cartoons, satirical poetry, right? These were all always used by dissidents and revolutionaries and radical thinkers. And that is because fiction as a medium, fiction as a form of storytelling, has an enormous amount of influence on humanity and the human understanding of the world. So that's it, guys. Those are my 3 reasons for why fiction is extremely important to gain knowledge. I hope you like that. Please like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.